Hello everybody, my name is Floyd. The paper I'm going to be presenting on is called Revenue Generation for Truthful Spectrum Auction in Dynamic Spectrum Access. It's written by Zhenqing Jia, Qiang Zhang, Qin Zhang, and Mingyan Liu. So, for the agenda we're going to get into when reviewing this paper, first we begin with the problem statement and motivation. What do the authors want to solve in this paper? And the thing they wanted to do is provide a solution for making an auction for secondary spectrum, which we'll talk about what that is, and then we'll get into the desired properties of this auction, then talk about the different models that are made available, such as the optimal auction and the suboptimal auction, then get into experimental results, how the different types of auctions performed in the test environment and the paper, and then a conclusion. So first off, we have the problem statement and motivation. What were the authors actually trying to solve? So as you can infer from the paper's title, the auction that we deal with in this paper has to deal with radio spectrum, right? Which is just the different frequency bands that exist that are allocated to certain types of companies that buy it from the government. And this sort of resource is actually very scarce just because you have to delegate it so that you don't have interference. If you have too many people broadcasting on the same band, which is just the same set of frequencies, you're going to have a lot of interference. So you have to, as the government, make sure you allocate it to people such that social welfare is maximized. And this sort of allocation by some big entity like the government to big users who are able to compete for the spectrum is called static spectrum allocation. So like I mentioned, it's for big companies that are able to interact with the government directly and buy these big contracts. And those are really big names, right? Something like T-Mobile or Verizon. But it's only those people that are able to buy leases from the government. If anybody less with them wants to buy, they have trouble. Additionally, you need a lot of capital in order to buy these contracts, and they go on for a long time, tens of years, before they need to be re-auctioned off. So they also cover a very large geographic region and frequency bands, meaning that a lot of these spectrum resources are actually not really utilized because you have to buy huge amounts of spectrum in large geographic areas, and you have a lot that the contracts are simply too big for what these big providers actually need to offer. So the question is, if we have all this wasted spectrum that's just not utilized but that's purchased, how can we increase spectrum utilization and actually end up making more money for these companies that buy them in the first place? So the solution proposed by the authors of the paper is to open up a secondary spectrum market. The idea is that a lot of smaller users want to access spectrum, but they're too small to buy from the government. They simply don't have the funds available, and they don't want to have the spectrum for the tens of years that are involved with those big government contracts. So primary users who did actually buy those contracts and are stuck with it for 10 years, they need to sell subsections of this unused spectrum to the secondary users. So the idea is that this will actually increase spectrum utilization because that spectrum wasn't used before, but now it's going to be used just by smaller companies, smaller entities. And this is going to increase revenue for the primary users as well, because like I mentioned, that spectrum wasn't actually useful to them before, but now they have a way to sell it and make money off of it. And they're going to give secondary users access, which means now all of a sudden the social welfare is benefited because these secondary users are going to be providing services with that bit of spectrum they get. So this is going to be known as dynamic spectrum access because it takes advantage of temporarily unused spectrum. That's sort of different than the static solution because it's just for a short amount of time and in a small area, and it has to happen very rapidly. Maybe you don't want to wait a lot of time to make a contract and finalize it. You want it to be quick. So that's why it's called dynamic. And the paper proposed that we should utilize auctions to sell this secondary spectrum because that allows us to optimize either for seller revenue or spectrum utilization, or that's the social welfare, right? Is how can we use our spectrum rather than leaving it unused and give society more access to data. Next, we will get into the specifications and the actual framework of the auction. So the secondary spectrum market is going to have contracts that are a bit different than the primary user contracts. So secondary spectrum contracts are going to be issued by the primary users to the secondary users. They're going to be shorter term, meaning it's only weeks or months is assumed rather than the decades that are available for those primary contracts. and they're going to have a much more granular coverage area. Say if I was a secondary user and maybe I just want access in Chicago, right? I would have to maybe buy some contracts and bid for contracts that are available in Chicago for unused spectrum from primary users. And in order to reduce interference, there's a rule that no two neighboring nodes can be allocated the same channel. That's just a typical thing that exists in the primary spectrum as well, but now it's just on a smaller scale, so we have to make sure that's maintained. Also, the geographic cell coverage is actually going to depend on selection by primary holders. As you can imagine, they're the ones who erect the cell towers in the first place or buy coverage in a certain area, so secondary users have no control over that. They just have to listen to what the primary users have already chosen. And then also in the auction, when a buyer submits a bid, BI, they're going to indicate both the number of channels they'd like to buy and their bidding price. So they're caring about the amount of spectrum they get, not actually the density. In reality, maybe that's not quite how it works exactly, but this is just generally what happens to be true for that secondary spectrum market, is that they just want spectrum to be given in general. They don't care about if it's super dense in a certain area. Additionally, the spectrum demand for any sort of subregion tends to be uniform, even though some regions are more valuable than others, right? Like in an urban area, you can imagine people want more access because the population is higher. So secondary users are very interested in those urban places, and when it's more rural, they're not as interested. But over those subregions, it's not like, oh, I need super dense coverage in this neighborhood of Chicago. No, I just want Chicago. So that's the subregion. Okay, so if we're going to use an auction, which one do the paper presenters actually want us to use? So it depends on what we're optimizing for. If the sellers want truthful bids from buyers, they have to use VCG or some second price auction. And VCG auction actually has a very high computational complexity, so that has to be taken into consideration. Yeah, you can get truthfulness by using it, but it's actually going to be really difficult for real-time allocation computation, since you have to compute, okay, where are we going to allocate the spectrum when we have all these bids lined up? Where are we going to assign the bids? That has to be really quick sometimes. Maybe you only need spectrum for a few minutes, maybe you need it for a few hours. Usually, as we assume, it's weeks or months, but we don't want that to be a slow thing. And with as many bidders as there might be, using VCG might be a problem a lot of the time. So if truthfulness is not actually important, we can actually use an efficient resource allocation algorithm in order to maximize revenue. If that's the goal of that algorithm, it will allow buyers to generally submit truthful bids, but it's just not quite as guaranteed. So in order to have a specification for an auction which is truthful and an auction which can be efficiently allocated, the authors of this paper split the auction formulation into two different sections, and the first was the optimal auction. So this is going to be based off of the VCG auction, which maximizes the sum of winning bids for the seller. And the valuations are going to work under a Bayesian assumption, which is that the valuations of the buyers are drawn from distributions which are actually known to the sellers, so people have enough information. And when it comes to allocation of the bids, this is going to be based off of Meyerson's optimal mechanism, which is a truthful mechanism that is going to maximize the auctioneer's expected revenue. And because it's based off a VCG auction, it's going to be using virtual valuation, which is the reservation price for each buyer. And we can see the function for that on the right. It's going to have monotone, non-decreasing values, and also it's going to discriminate those high-value bidders from the low-value bidders in order to efficiently optimize the allocation of bids, which means that it's going to be maximizing the virtual valuation of all users. As we can see in the bottom right, it's involving that maximization function. And this is actually an allocation algorithm which is computationally very complex. It's NP hard, meaning it's going to be exponential. So that makes it very difficult for doing quickly. And if you have a lot of buyers, a lot of things to sell, you're going to be having an even tougher time finding the optimal solution. Fortunately, there's a solution for how to decrease the amount of time it takes to correctly assign the bids, and that's in what the paper authors call the suboptimal auction. So it's going to be non-VCG. It's not quite guaranteed to be truthful all of the time, but it does approximate VCG, and it takes much less computation to perform. So it's based off of 3 steps. First, bid ranking is performed, where you're going to be using those virtual bids, the virtual valuations, and sort them monotonically, either all decreasing or all increasing based off of a function. Then the winner is determined using a greedy algorithm, which is going to iteratively check sell demands for every single buyer against a selected critical buyer. So the idea there is that if you look at each buyer and you say, hey, do you have a bigger bid than the critical buyer or less than the critical buyer? Well, if you have a bigger bid, okay, I guess you win currently. If you have a smaller bid, you don't win. And so that keeps on going until the winners are determined for the bids. And then spectrum allocation and payment calculation is performed, which the function for that is average virtual valuation per cell times the buyer's requested amount of spectrum. So this auction is going to be monotonic. Again, it's either going to be strictly increasing or strictly decreasing. It's going to be truthful, which is actually interesting. They proved that in the paper that it was truthful. Even though it's not VCG, it's still truthful. But it only has polynomial complexity, so it can be solved much more quickly, allowing for much quicker bidding and solutions to be provided. Next, we will look at the experimental results, which the authors of the paper have provided in order to better compare the different types of auctions presented. So first, we're going to talk about how these experiments were actually formulated. The simulation was performed with 25 hexagonal cells, just like the figure on the right, where each cell is going to have a certain amount of coverage area and can offer spectrum to buyers. We're actually going to just be fixed at 5 buyers, each requesting at most 1 channel per cell. And there was also this additional experimental auction that was added just for the simulation portion of the paper, called the truthful auction, which works a lot like the suboptimal auction in its algorithm, but it's going to be using a true valuation instead of virtual valuation. And we just want to see how that performs compared to the other auctions that we listed before. So the buyer's bids are going to be based off of a distribution which can either be uniform, where you have that first equation f of z equals z, or it's going to be exponential, like f of z equals 1 minus e to the negative lambda z. And these results were averaged over 100 different iterations where you had randomly generated sets of demands every time in order to see what it looked like in practice. And these are the graphs which we really pay attention to. When analyzing them, we can see that the suboptimal and optimal auctions perform nearly identically almost all the time, which is really promising. It means that you're actually able to perform good algorithms with heuristics, like the one in this paper for the suboptimal auction. It's done a lot quicker, but it provides similar results. We can also see how certain types of auctions perform a lot better for different sort of categories. So in the revenue category, for both the exponential and the uniform distributions, we see that the suboptimal and optimal algorithms are able to provide much higher revenue generation, especially when the number of channels is increasing that are available. The truthful auction does not perform very well there, but it does perform much better when it comes to spectrum utilization, which makes sense because spectrum utilization is supposed to represent the sort of social welfare benefit, and the suboptimal and optimal auctions are looking for maximizing revenue. Additionally, we can look at the different spectrum utilization graphs, where the suboptimal auction is generally better for a comparison of revenue versus spectrum utilization, meaning in general those are going to be preferred, which makes sense. And if I was to make a comment on this, I would say the revenue generation is probably what's going to be motivating all of this in the first place, because that's what the primary users of spectrum who own the big contracts in the first place are looking to sell. They're looking to sell so that they make money. They're not exactly looking out for, are these bids perfectly truthful? Are they going to provide the highest spectrum utilization? What they care about is money. So in reality, I think it does make sense to be prioritizing the suboptimal and optimal auctions. So in conclusion, this paper presented a lot of really interesting findings when it comes to reusing spectrum and giving it to those secondary users from the primary users in an auction. I think this is a great paper to be interested in game theory because of how it uses the auction, and it applies really well to real-life spectrum reuse. These smaller parties are going to probably become more and more frequently interested in buying spectrum, so it's great if they had an avenue to do so through an auction system just like this. I also thought it was interesting that the algorithms performed really well in the experimental environment, but it would have been nice to have more environments tested because the one was kind of, I guess, optimal, and it was strange that the suboptimal and optimal auctions were so similar. I wonder if that sort of degrades as you start adding more bidders. So the question I have for you to answer is, which auction was best for spectrum utilization for both uniform and exponential distributions? This will be involving the graphs just a few slides ago. And the question is, which of these auctions, logarithmic auction, truthful auction, optimal auction, or suboptimal auction, is best for maximizing spectrum utilization, no matter what. Okay, and that's it for the presentation. Thank you very much for listening.